Good afternoon and welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from the Frontier. Trust you're well, looking after your personal health and the health of your family in what remains an extraordinary year. I just heard that Irfan Khan, 53 years old, very young, passed away, and I remember watching him for the first time in a film called The Warrior. If you've ever had a chance to see that, if you haven't seen that, do watch it. And of course, in that rather dark Mira movie called Salam Bombay are the ones that I recall. So may his soul rest in peace. Let me start with macro thoughts. As I've said, I remain of the view that we're going to enter a Great Depression. The Bloomberg Commodity Index hit a fresh low yesterday, further evidence of that. And as I've said, the virus is not correlated to endogenous market dynamics, but is an exogenous uncertainty that remains unresolved. This is a video said to be from Guangzhou, China. A hotel complex that includes shops and restaurants has been locked down after a push alert that told occupants to evacuate immediately. That's from Dave Greenwich, 57. And this is the issue. When you open up your economy, you're risking a second round. And you can see that already in Germany, where the RO rate has popped above 1 again. And in Ghana, where they opened up, they've had a huge surge of cases. And therefore, a V-shaped recovery is really a fantasy. Home thoughts, I like this photograph of the Queen from Ranthambore via Jayant Sharma. I've always wanted to go there. Maybe we'll have to go there in a few years' time now. The Pentagon formally released 3 Navy videos showing unidentified aerial phenomena. There was a release a few years back, which they totally ignored. It's interesting, therefore, the timing of this release from the official Pentagon channel, of course. Pentagon on Monday formally released 3 unclassified videos taken by Navy pilots that have circulated for years, showing interactions with unidentified aerial phenomena. One of the videos shows an incident from 2004, and the other 2 were recorded in January 2015, according to Sue Goff, a Defense Department spokeswoman. After a thorough review, the department has determined that the authorized release of these unclassified videos does not reveal any sensitive capabilities or systems and does not impinge on any subsequent investigations of military airspace incursions by unidentified aerial phenomena, Goff said. When they were still about 40 miles out, the ship radioed and said the object was at the rendezvous point, having traversed the distance in less than a minute, the pilot told the Times. "Dude, this is an effing drone, bro," a pilot exclaims on the video. Another person says there's a whole fleet of them. They're all going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots to the west. "Look at that thing, dude," the first person said. "It's rotating." In the other 2015 video, an object is shown from above, speeding over the ocean, prompting the pilot to excitedly remark, "What the fuck is that?" 5 Navy pilots who spotted the objects in 2015 told the Times in 2017 that they had a series of interactions with unidentified aircraft during training missions in 2014 and 2015 along the East Coast from Virginia to Florida. And here's some video of this unidentified object seen in footage captured by the Navy in 2004, CBS News. And that took me to one of my favorite passages by Don DeLillo. The specialist is monitoring data on his mission console when a voice breaks in, a voice that carried with it a strange and unspecifiable poignancy. He checks in with his flight dynamics and conceptual paradigm officers at Colorado Command. We have a deviate tomahawk. We copy, there's a voice. We have gross oscillation here. There's some interference. I've gone redundant, but I'm not sure it's helping. We are clearing an outframe to locate source. Thank you, Colorado. It is probably just selective noise. You are negative red on the step function quad. It was a voice, I told them. We have just received an affirm on selective noise. We will correct Tomahawk. In the meantime, advise you to stay redundant. The voice, in contrast to Colorado's metallic pidgin, is a mélange of repartee, laughter and song with a quality of purest, sweetest sadness. Somehow, we were picking up signals from radio programs of 40, 50, 60 years ago. The aerial phenomena observed in the videos remains characterized as unidentified. So quite a story, really, and it's the timing of the official release interesting in itself. I've written about the way we live now. You felt the land taking you back to what was there 100 years ago, to what had been there always. Don DeLillo, again, everything is barely weeks. Everything is days. We have minutes to live. And the Rolling Stones have put out a song, Living in a Ghost Town. And it certainly is a new 21st century that we find ourselves in. There is a luminous and fairy tale feel to life in quarantine, and as you know, most fairy tales have an oftentimes dark and dangerous and unspoken undercurrent. Political reflections, the Financial Times, how Kim Jong-un keeps the West's spies in the dark. The closer you are to the center, the more important you are, said Ms. Lee. And this is the same Ms. Lee who wakes up, fires up her computer and starts scouring North Korean newspapers, television broadcasts, academic journals, and obscure websites affiliated to the secretive nation. Former US government analysts do not think Mr. Kim is dead, but they're still trying to work out exactly what health problems he may be suffering. For this one, I'm inclined to think that nobody knows, including US intelligence, said Miss Lee. I hope he's fine. I do know how he's doing, relatively speaking, Mr. Trump said. Trust me, they US officials don't know what's going on, said Ms. Terry, now a senior fellow with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. It's not only the Americans, it's the rest of the world. There is a reason why no one knew for 48 hours that former leader Kim Jong-il had died, and we found out only because the North Koreans decided to tell us. Their control of information is so tight, the only way we would know is if one of the top elites is on our payroll, but even then, how would they know? Young Pak, another former CIA analyst, described the system as Mr. Kim at the bullseye of multiple information circles, meaning the regime deliberately deprived not only the wider population, but also parts of the inner circle of information. The bureaucracy don't talk to each other. Kim has been purging hundreds of people. He wants to keep shaking things up so no one knows who to trust, and individuals are less likely to start rising up the ranks and collect a group of friends. Secrecy is part of survival. It is not a situation that even North Korea's high-ranking officials will be aware of, except to Mr. Kim's wife and his closest aides, no doubt his sister. In 2011, South Korean broadsheet The Chosen Libo quoted intelligence sources claim that the late leader Kim Jong-il had used 3 trains, 2 move simultaneously to prevent terror attacks while the third serves as backup. Unlike his hermit-like father, Kim Jong-un has engaged with international leaders. Since 2018, he has attended summits with Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, and South Korea's Moon Jae-in, as well as 3 meetings with Mr. Trump. We don't know what's happening because the Kim regime doesn't want people to know, said Ms. Pak. They want to be coup-proof. The sister, in my opinion, is obviously the successor. She was unleashed on February 2018 like a secret weapon on the world. And Kim Jong-il began his career as the head of state's propaganda and agitation department, and it's clear that Kim Yo-jong holds the same role. And you see that in those amazing opening shot scenes of Kim Jong-un surrounded by a phalanx of North Korean officials, and plenty more. You know, the events that took place on that Friday at the truce village of Panmunjom and during the Inter-Korean summit were breathtaking for the Hollywood optics. The opening shot of Kim Jong-un surrounded by a phalanx of North Korean ninja officials was almost as good, I wrote, as the opening sequence in P.T. Anderson's Boogie Nights. This was cinema of the highest level, which is no surprise when you consider that Kim Jong-il, the father, was obsessed with cinema, amassed arguably the world's largest film collection, over 20,000 bootlegged 35mm screening copies. Kim Jong-il also had a penchant for Hennessy parody cognac, was the world's largest buyer of that cognac, importing up to $800,000 of the stuff a year. Kim Jong-il began his career as the head of the state's propaganda and agitation department, and it's clear that Kim Jong-un's sister, Kim Yo-jong, holds the same role and evidently handles all the optics and is a chip off the old block. You know, those Mount Pektu pictures of Kim on his white horse and so much more, the whole Hollywood practically Nazi-like presentation that we see. And as I wrote, far away in distant lands lies the hermit kingdom, and they've all had tiny little hands like the elves and the shoemaker. There is remarkably little speculation about a potential second wave of COVID-19. I'm rather reluctant to enthusiastically join "there is light at the end of the tunnel" party, said Fongan_FX. And look at what's happened in Germany. We've popped over an RO rate of 1 on that very, very gradual opening. Ghana as well, lots of cases yesterday. So I absolutely agree with the gentleman. I think the Gladwell moment has definitively arrived, and to escape it is not going to be so simple. The only way to have a viable economy and society is to control this epidemic, so it's not really a trade-off. That's Jeffrey Sachs in The New Yorker. There are many aspects of any major crisis that are similar in character, in that they require governments to assess the situation with sophistication, to identify options, to come up with strategies, to implement them. Crisis management has a lot of common points. The nature of the crisis could be geopolitical, it could be a climate-related shock or a disease. I would say the core issues are the capacity of political leaders and their inner team, and the capacity of the institutions of governance, agencies, departments, and ministries to be able to process information in a timely manner, and to be able to harness expert advice and evidence in a timely way. We live in a complicated world. If you try to wing it, as Trump does, you end up with more than 40,000 deaths. If you want to solve a problem, you have to be systematic about it and know whom to turn to and how to listen and amass evidence. I've never seen anything like the narcissism of this man, and here we are, a country so rich in expertise, in resources, in capacities, and yet we're watching a complete failure of a political response with a massive loss of life in real time. A reality TV star botched the response to a global pandemic, and now we're all imprisoned in our homes and forced to watch him daily, is another way to put what Jeffrey Sachs is saying. That was Jenna Friedman. What is thriving, however, is all that ridiculous red culture and nauseating adulation that the system heaps on itself via shameless pro-party hacks who chirrup hosannas at every turn. Remarkable similarity between China and the United States in that regard. The virus may be the most dangerous adversary America has ever faced. It's like the US was invaded. That was Plunges. The normal defenses fail. It can't be bombed. Bank accounts can't be frozen. Unbreakable morale. No supply chain. Lives off the land. Infinite reinforcements and fully decentralized. To watch the daily briefing is to understand that the control machine has a novice, a hubristic Narcissus in charge of the console. If you retweet your own quote tweet of you praising your own tweet, you might be a narcissist, says Northman Trader. We are the hollow men, we are the stuffed men, leaning together, headpiece filled with straw. Alas, our dried voices, when we whisper together, are quiet and meaningless. I also said leaders are saying don't panic, and I want to say, look chum, you're not Merkel, and just a few days ago you were telling me it's all cool, it's just the flu. Others might take you seriously. On what basis, I know not, but I don't. Merkel's frankness and clarity beats Trump's virus bluster. Business Week, the pandemic has amplified the two leaders' most fundamental traits. For Trump, a proclivity to bask in the limelight and a loose relationship with the facts. For Merkel, the frankness and clarity of a scientist who takes comfort in data. Trump has taken a near opposite approach. In the early days of the outbreak, he had insisted his administration had it under control. And for weeks he continued to downplay the impact the virus was set to have on the US. When asked about his optimism conflicted with the increasingly visible devastation of the pandemic, he said, I'm not about bad news. Now that denial is threatening to cost him the White House in the November election. In March and early April, as coronavirus infections and deaths mounted in the US, Trump's approval rating plunged 6 percentage points, according to a Gallup poll. Merkel has always employed a methodical approach to her job, a style Germans have especially come to appreciate during a pandemic. Key among the reasons for the nation's success, public health experts say, has been testing. As the outbreak took hold, Germany launched an aggressive testing regime to track it. That data helped identify infected people more quickly, limiting the spread and enabling early medical interventions that kept sick people from deteriorating. While testing has been the foundation of Merkel's success, it has become Trump's Achilles heel. Lack of data has made it more difficult for public health experts to track the virus and has obscured the scale of the outbreak. On March 13, when asked about the testing fiasco, Trump said, I don't take responsibility at all. There have been more, when this was written, 973,000 confirmed cases in the US, more than 54,000 people have died. Germany, with a population roughly 1/4 the size of the US, has had about 6,000 deaths. He declared at an April 23 news conference that coronavirus might not come back at all in the fall and winter, and if it did, it would be in smaller doses we can contain. More than 50% of Americans now disapprove of Trump's response to the outbreak, compared to 46% who approve, a gap that has widened this week, according to 538. We'll have to live with this virus for a long time, Merkel told Germany's parliament ahead of a European Union summit. She warned it is not the end phase, but still just the beginning. And I'd agree with her. gave a taste of her scientific knowledge during a news conference on April 16 when she lectured Germans about a quantitative measure of how quickly the virus spreads, known as the reproduction factor. This is thin ice, she said. This is really a situation in which caution is the order of the day and not foolhardiness. She's got a point. Trump's response to the pandemic is certain to be the defining issue of the 2020 election. Rights group condemn El Salvador president for releasing startling photos of hundreds of jailed gang members stripped to underwear and pressed together in formation, part of a punishment for an outbreak of violence. And that is a super spreading event if you ever wanted to see one. The viral moment has indeed arrived. As I said previously, quoting Don DeLillo, there's always more to it. This is what history consists of. It is the sum total of the things they aren't telling us. Researchers from Zhejiang University said they have direct evidence that the virus has acquired mutations capable of substantially changing its pathogenicity. Another important point. And that's why I wrote on the 16th of Feb, viruses exhibit non-linear and exponential characteristics. Currencies, dollar index just below 100 at 99.712. Emerging market currencies rebounding a little. Euro dollar 108.58 last. Gold, where is that? 1709. Lots of people have gone a little bit bearish on it, saying it's a double top at 1736. I think they're all going to be trapped when we get the next move towards 1780. Because we're in an unprecedented print shop, as Scott Burke called it. I think it's correlated to the COVID-19, and just like the COVID-19 turned parabolic and is already non-linear and exponential, gold will be the same. And I'm looking for $2,000, as I said, on the 22nd of March. In oil, COVID translates to no bid, tweeted Petro Matrix. As I said, we're now entering the twilight zone for a lot of oil producers. Saudi Arabia's FX reserves plunged $27 billion in March, the largest monthly decline in data going back 2 decades. That's from Javier Blas. As I said on the 6th of April, what I do know is this: regime implosion is coming to the oil producers. Demand is created, and a return to a hyper-connected 100 million barrels per day world is not going to happen for the foreseeable future. Essentially, the price of crude oil is perfectly correlated to the COVID-19 hard stop. Crude oil, last I checked, was around $13.48, but big concerns will go into negative territory again. Saudi Arabia's huge $25 billion effort to stabilize its FX in March meant that EM FX reserves for 14 major economies fell by $170 billion last month, a 2.81% monthly drawdown, the second biggest in over 15 years. That's why I said on the 6th of April, we're watching the great decoupling unfold in front of our eyes, from Brazil to South Africa to India. 20 years of good times are now ended. Why is EM orange decoupling from the S&P 500 white, asks Robin Brooks. Huge US fiscal and monetary easing that EM can't match. As a result, potentially deeper recessions in EM than US. EM starting to flirt with QE, which is currency negative. COVID-19 shock hit the US earlier than most EMs. Violent protests have destroyed most of Tripoli, Lebanon's banks in the last 24 hours. That's from Joyce Karam. One protester died, 54 Lebanese army forces injured, situation fueled by economic crisis, austerity measures, and collapse of Lebanese pound. I sort of preemptively wrote about this in October last year in an article called The New Economy of Anger, and I quoted Paul Virilio in his book Speed and Politics. The revolutionary contingent attains its ideal form not in the place of production but in the street, where for a moment it stops being a cog in the technical machine and itself becomes a motor, a machine of attack. In other words, a producer of speed. Moody's Investor Services cuts India's growth forecast to 0.2% for 2020 from 2.5% projected in March. And I take you back to the New Yorker, Blood and Soil in Narendra Modi's India. The accelerated growth was a fantastically crafted fiction, according to Prasad. Sub-Saharan Africa, daily confirmed cases in Africa are building. That's Scott Gottlieb. We are sort of topping 1,000 cases a day and then coming back below it, but we're in that sort of area. As I said on the 2nd of March, what we know is that the coronavirus is exponential, non-linear, and multiplicative. And we also know exponential disease propagation looks like this: nothing, nothing, nothing. Then cluster, 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 and just have a look. We've got a lot of clusters now in sub-Saharan Africa, then boom. In Ethiopia, is Ethiopia transparent about the COVID-19 situation in the country? This was via Harun Maruf. Ethiopia's latest notification on COVID-19 situational update paints the picture of a country that is relatively in good shape and very much in control of the spread of the pandemic across the country. According to Lancet, it's a high-risk country due to the calculus importation on the basis of their air travel links with China and other countries. Ethiopian Airlines is the largest carrier in Africa and operates nearly half of the flights from Africa to China. I've touched on this before. Chinese businessmen and women visit Ethiopia in considerable numbers. Given what we know about the coronavirus in Ethiopia, it can be reasonably concluded that the COVID-19 saga circulated by the authorities in Addis Ababa is at best incomplete. The coronavirus, he writes, is a wrecker. More importantly, Ethiopia must be truthful and transparent about what it knows, what it does not know about the state of the pandemic in the country. The culture of suppressing, manipulating truth and facts or outright denial has not served Ethiopia in the past. This is Hassan Kainan, former professor at the Somali National University. And then I reference you back to, I think it was 2 days ago, they had a hit rate of 0.1%. And I said, statistically, that's remarkable. And what I really meant is it's not believable. And then we've had report number 46, similar sort of statistics, and they're just not credible. Or the testing equipment they're using is useless. It's one or the other. Low COVID-19 death toll raises hope that Africa may be spared the worst. This is David Pilling in the Financial Times, and there's been some optimism, and I'll tell you why. Since the first African coronavirus case was confirmed on February 14, when a Chinese national was diagnosed in Egypt, the virus has spread to virtually all corners of the continent. Bill Gates warned the disease could claim a horrifying 10 million African lives. Kennedy Odedi, I don't get it, he said. 400 people tested randomly in Kibera slum last week. Only 3 were positive. For me, it was good news, but you've got to extrapolate that number. Africa is just over 32,000 official cases of the virus that has infected almost 3 million people around the world. At face value, figures suggest a continent of 1.2 billion had suffered fewer COVID-19 deaths than the US was recording each day. People are very cautiously beginning to breathe a sigh of relief, although it is too early to say that we've dodged a bullet. Murithi Mutiga, crisis group. There was, he said, no hard evidence that any factors specific to Africa, whether a younger population, warm weather, or even the prevalence of BCG vaccinations against tuberculosis had any impact on the disease's spread. This is John Kengasong, Director of Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. I would be extremely cautious at this point to make any statement that we're moving slowly and that there are special factors, he said, adding that confirmed cases have risen by more than 40% in a week. suggested Africa might simply be behind the curve with the pandemic picking up speed now. Our testing level is extremely low, he said, implying many cases have gone undetected. Some 415,000 tests mean only 400 per million had been carried out. Paul Hunter, professor of medicine at the University of East Anglia, said the authorities were right to be cautious. He said still there were reasons to suspect the virus might be less deadly in Africa, where droplets spread diseases such as flu have tended to spread more slowly. The continent had only one case of severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, during the 2002-2003 outbreak, with a sole infection in Cape Town. Slower spread of airborne infections, remember those droplets, said Professor Hunter, might be attributable to less dense populations, the effect of ultraviolet light, or a climate that meant people spent more time outside. In the case of coronavirus, he said Africa's youthful population may also help to explain the low death rate so far. The median age in Africa is 19.4 years, compared with 40 in Europe and 38 in the US. In South Africa, deaths in the year up to April 14 were generally within the bounds of expectation. Doubted that the official statistics were wildly inaccurate. If infections were higher, we would see hospitals being overwhelmed, which is not happening, but it could still happen. Actually, on the ground evidence is that there are places where hospitals are being overwhelmed, so they just haven't done their homework. Until health experts knew exactly what was going on with the disease, she said governments were right to err on the side of caution. We need to keep measuring and to keep testing. So, going back to that point about Kibera slums, 400 people tested randomly, only 3 were positive, Liam Taylor 100. If that is a representative sample, it would imply over 18,000 cases in Nairobi slums, against an official figure of just 363 cases in the entire country. Charlie Robertson has been referencing the demographics. Because the coronavirus hits the elderly the most, it is no surprise that in Africa, the countries that have seen the most per capita are the older countries like Algeria, Mauritius, and Morocco. We model this assuming a 20% infected population and then converting deaths into weeks of normal fatalities. US would be 5.5 weeks, 1.7 for Ghana. Dr. Ahmed Kelebi of The Lancet, some good news on COVID-19 trend curve for Kenya and East Africa. 6 weeks after the index case in Kenya, our test positive rate, percentage of the positive tests against the total tested, is much lower than most countries, even lower than South Korea at the same point. I've written before that we're looking into the rearview mirror. WHO themselves have said coronavirus cases in Africa could shoot up from the thousands now to 10 million within 3 to 6 months, according to very provisional modelling. Nigeria is to begin phased and gradual easing of lockdowns in Lagos, Abuja. However, the deaths in Kano are real. Lost my grandmum yesterday and her burial was delayed for several hours because grave diggers were overwhelmed. Issue in Nigeria, as with most African countries, is testing capacity. That's Polsec analyst. China in Africa is more than a land grab, Bloomberg opinion, who tend to be kind to China because of the business of terminals. China has plenty to gain from lending a hand to its friends battling the coronavirus in Africa, contrary to some perceptions. That won't mean opportunistic grabs in oil, copper, or arable land. The biggest prize for Beijing is political capital. Barely a fifth of countries in Africa have free universal health care. The Central African Republic had 3 ventilators for a population of 5 million before the crisis. A handful of nations had none. China is Africa's largest trading partner and creditor, and Beijing moved swiftly to provide aid as the virus spread. China endorsed a temporary freeze on debt payments agreed upon by the Group of 20, unusual for a country that tends to prefer bilateral efforts. The scale and breadth of the current shock may have played a part in that decision, according to Lauren Johnson of the China Institute at SOAS, University London. The heavy-handed measures to tackle a cluster of coronavirus cases in Guangzhou, which has a significant population of African traders and students, fed an underlying distrust and risked undoing the gains of mass diplomacy. Efforts have already paid off relative to far more expensive gambits like its rapprochement with Pakistan. Given the pandemic, collapsing oil, a disinterested US and a distracted Europe, it can do so more cheaply than ever. To be clear, mineral riches and mercantile interests do matter. China's companies are eyeing a young growing population of 1.3 billion consumers. Africa represents less than 5% of Beijing's $4 trillion of annual global trade. The real great game is about securing a Chinese candidate at the head of the FAO and getting a friendly one at the World Health Organization and landing the country's first overseas military base. More countries attended President Xi Jinping's 2018 African Summit in the UN General Assembly, held a few weeks later. What happens next will center on debt. China's government, banks and contractors extended more than $150 billion to Africa's governments and state-owned enterprises between 2010 and 2018. Chinese overseas loan making plateaued or even dipped of late. Land grabs won't be part of the equation, I wouldn't be so sure. China has in the past used credit to get production rights, say in Angola. They reference Sri Lanka's precarious levels of debt. The Hambantota moment, which I called, ultimately led to the concession of a strategic port, had deeper roots than China's loans. Zambia, currently battling Western miners and struggling with debt. The government may want a quick debt for equity fix, but it's unclear Beijing would be so keen. There are plenty of unknowns, not least around China's own faltering economy, and domestic sentiment will affect its ability to lend. I wrote about this in an article, The End of Vanity, China, Africa, Win-Win. I was talking about China's expected to grow 1.2%. It'll be negative in my view. I was saying the defining engagement of the last 2 decades for sub-Saharan Africa has been the sub-Saharan Africa and China relationship. The entire China-Africa relationship has been an extraordinary exercise in narrative framing and linguistic control, accompanied by a chorus of party hacks chirruping hosannas at every turn, amplifying largely meaningless feel-good phrases artfully placed in the mouths of our politicians and our newspapers. It is remarkable. I referenced the FOCAC 2018 Beijing Summit. September has just set in Beijing, bringing in with it a refreshing breeze and picturesque autumn scenery is how Xi Jinping started. The ocean is vast because it rejects no rivers. But he did say then that funds for Africa should not be for vanity projects. I described the China emerging markets frontier feedback loop phenomenon, said it was positive for the last 2 decades but has now undergone a trend reversal, and that the rand is the purest proxy for this phenomenon. African countries heavily dependent on China being the main taker are also at the bleeding edge of this phenomenon, and I said the pressure point will not ease soon but will continue to intensify. I was said in an interview with Al Jazeera, China had a singular and positive influence in Africa. It rebalanced the demand side for Africa's commodities and also bought those commodities on a long-term basis. It was this which triggered the African recovery some 2 decades ago. However, since then, a freewheeling China has favorited elites, facilitated large-scale looting via inflated infrastructure, some of which were white elephants, and has lumped the African citizen with the tab. I said then how this plays out is now the key to Sino-African relations going forward. A Hambantota scenario would be problematic, I said, and we're precisely there now. The Hambantota moment has arrived. The Wall Street Journal is reporting that some African governments who are already bilaterally petitioning China for relief say Chinese envoys are citing provisions in loan agreements that would transfer collateral, in some cases strategic state assets, into Beijing's hands. I concluded that point by saying basically China has an option to buy sub-Saharan strategic assets at fire sale prices. In mid-July last year, Ali Manzu obtained and tweeted this video of the president of Tanzania rejecting in absolute terms what Americans call China's debt trap diplomacy. South African Finance Minister Tito Mboweni said the economy would contract as much as 6.4% during a conference call with clients of Goldman Sachs. He's not wrong. South African All Shares down 12.36%, dollar rand 18.55, Egyptian EGX30 minus 25.4%. The IMF Executive Board approved $3.4 billion to help Nigeria address the severe economic impact of COVID-19. Nigeria All Shares minus 15.33%, and the Ghana Stock Exchange is down 8.07%. David Ndii, the economist here in Kenya, says COVID-19 is not a passing cloud. It is more of a socio-economic disruptor rather than it is a pandemic. And I think that's a really important point. Snap out of the waiting for post-COVID-19 mindset. Adapting to COVID-19 is the solution. Real Kunal Shah, an example, Kenya, for example, has had a limited shutdown, not really severe healthcare issue, but the loss of tourism, diaspora, remittance, exports of flowers and other agricultural products will start to see huge currency pressures. Governor Sonko, I have a message to some of my friends at Harambee House who are drunk with power. Power comes, power goes, power is temporary and transient, but the will of the people and the will of God is eternal. He might well be right, but I don't know whether he's expressing the will of God, which took me back to Ecclesiastes, one of my favorite passages in the Bible. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and goes around to the north. Around and around goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, where they flow again, all things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new, it has been already in the ages before us? There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things yet to be among those who come after. Governor Sonko again in the 90s, Honourable Nicholas Biwott was a powerful man. Before his demise, he used to sit lonely at a corner at Serena Hotel. Few people bothered to say hi to him. Many others came before him and many others after him. But the supreme will of God has never faltered, he said. Take off from Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. This is a great photograph by Simon Watts of the Concorde. Safaricom, which is the more than 50% of the stock market, released their full year earnings. Voice revenue was down 1.41%. Mpesa revenue was up 12.6%. Mobile data revenue up 12.13%. Service revenue up 4.78%. Total revenue up 4.91%. Profit after tax up 17.87%. Earnings per share up 17.95%. Cash and cash equivalents up 33.6%. Normal dividend increased by 12%. M-Pesa grew 12.6% year on year on an underlying basis, excluding the impact of betting and the COVID-19 response. M-Pesa grew 17.2%. It would be interesting to know high-frequency data, whether we've seen a slowdown in velocity in the system since the COVID-19 hit. Mobile data, we're pleased to report that on average our customers are now using more than 1 gigabyte per month, and that mobile data achieved double-digit revenue growth of 12.1% for the year. Well, that's perfect alignment with the new quarantined world, isn't it? Everyone's using a whole lot more data, as we said, quarantine in our homes. Board remain committed to investing in the business. Proposed dividend for full year 20 is 1 shilling and 40 cents, which is 80% of the profit. Due to the uncertainty emanating from the COVID-19 pandemic, many parameters that would normally be factored in for a prudent guidance are unclear. So strong double-digit growth. They are surely aligned in some respects to the new COVID-19 economy via the internet and mobile data and Mpesa, although it would be interesting to see high-frequency Mpesa data, especially around velocity within the system. It is a mobile century at the end of the day. Kenya shilling 107.20, Nairobi All Share down 18.3%, NSE20 down 26.62%. Thank you for listening.